Good evening, and everybody, and welcome to Inside the Avatar Studio. The purpose of this particular session, as we've had a number of these in the past, is to bring together innovative leaders from virtual technology to discuss their perceptions, perspectives, and predictions of what being virtual means in today's society. Today's guest with me here is buyer sellers Robert Bloomfield. Robert is a professor with Cornell University, the Johnson Graduate School of Management. Over the past 4 years, Robert has been an advocate for the serious uses of virtual worlds for education and distance collaboration. His extensive experience includes the use of simulation software to study effects of regulatory policy, investor welfare, and financial market behaviors. Robert's virtual world activities have been covered extensively in the media, from Business Week and the New York Times to CFO Magazine and Technology Review. Currently, Robert is the host and editor-in-chief of the weekly Metanomics event series in Second Life, as I'm sure everybody is aware here, in addition to serving on the editorial boards of peer-reviewed journals, including the Accounting Review, the Journal of Accounting and Economics, and the Journal of Accounting Research. Robert, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. This is we've been talking on and off for the last couple of years, and it's going to be kind of interesting to actually have you over here for a change. We get to actually have one of these conversations in a bit more of a public forum this time around. Yeah. The topic that we were looking at today is this idea of the first 2,500 days of Second Life. At this particular point in time, and it's sort of a takeoff on Kevin Kelly's idea of the first 5,000 days of the internet. And we're looking at, in general, we're looking at sort of what benefits have come out of the last 2,500 days, right? Because really, when you look at a lot of information that Kevin Kelly and others have talked about in terms of the first 5,000 days of the internet, there really was this tipping point, or this point at which the web sort of coalesced from being this thing that nobody really understood to this thing that became ubiquitous inside our lives. And yet the first 2,500 days of this virtualization, which we call Second Life, does or doesn't necessarily appear to be going that same direction. And I know through your conversations with a lot of very influential speakers over the last couple of years of running Metanomics, I'd really like to get your take in terms of what you've seen over the last 5, 6, 7 years that you've been looking at these virtual spaces.
I think the first thing that I'd point out is there's such a difference between the internet and Second Life. The first one being that Second Life is a single, it's run by a single company. Now they bring users in, user-generated content is obviously a huge thing here, but it's within the guidelines that Linden Lab sets, and within the, compared to the internet, the restricted technology that Linden Lab allows people to use. So when, I think it's also instructive just to think about where the internet was 2,500 days ago, so what has changed outside of Second Life in the last 2,500 days, and then compare that to how Second Life itself and its community has changed. And there, I think there's no comparison. Entire companies have come and gone. Hardware has come out, 2,500 days ago. I mean, I've got a Droid now, a Droid phone in my hand that does it's just unimaginable 2,500 days ago that you could have a phone that does all the things that this does. So I guess that's sort of the first thing that occurs to me is what I don't see in the virtual world community is the kind of cross company innovation that you're seeing in the larger internet.
Well, that's kind of interesting because I mean and again there were three things that Kevin Kelly sort of pointed to in terms of what he was sort of expecting to see over the next 5,000 days, and to a certain extent it would seem as if we should be able to take advantage of a lot of these benefits now. The first one was this idea of embodiment, the idea of an Internet of Things, and that we wouldn't actually, like similar to the computer, not necessarily having a hard drive, that you would your computer, your mobile device, your Android phone, whatever it is that you're working with from a technology standpoint, would just simply touch the cloud. Right, it would just sort of stroke it, type of thing.
I'm wondering where you're going with this embodiment and stroking.
Well, no, not in those particular areas. But I mean, and this idea, the second idea was this idea of restructuring in terms of the semantic web and access to information at all levels. And then the third being this idea of codependence, that we as being plugged into this become extensions of this of the machine almost. And to a certain extent, it would seem as if those capabilities are all they're sort of all here, but they're sort of not. And when you're talking about having an Android phone and it not 7 years ago, not even being able to contemplate having something like this at your beck and call. I mean, it very much seems, I guess, to a certain extent, almost as if we're missing the boat on something. That there's something missing from what we're doing with inside a virtual context.
Yeah. Well, I'd say if you look at the changes that we have seen, and the changes that Kevin Kelly is anticipating, I mean, I think it's worth asking: are those things that strengthen the? So you've got the supply and the demand issue, and so I guess I would ask two questions when I look at the recent and projected evolution of the web. Just of the internet technology itself. One is it making it more possible to do the things that Second Life and virtual worlds promise? And I think the answer to that is yes in some ways. But the more difficult challenge for virtual worlds, I think, is on the demand side. Does it reduce or increase the desire that consumers and producers have to develop a virtual world presence? And I think there the answer is more pessimistic for virtual worlds, because if you look, I mean, I think back to when I had a chance at the SLCC in Tampa. So that must have been 2008. I had a chance to interview Philip Rosedale about, where were we? Bevan is saying 2009. So where were we before Tampa?
Before Tampa would have been Chicago.
Okay, now I'm just, okay, now Bevan says I'm right. So, but anyway, so the, I had a chance to interview him and ask him sort of how he saw the technological changes getting, what was helping and what was hurting Second Life. And his big point was that they were really, and again, so this is the summer of '08. And back then he was saying, well, we were really caught off guard by the rise of the laptop computer, that we have been designing Second Life to run on PCs. It's very, bandwidth and processor intensive. And it was a setback for them that now they've got people who have off-the-shelf laptops that, struggle on both the bandwidth and the processing, and maybe, don't have the option for a plug-in graphics card. Now I look over at my desk at my Droid phone, and I say, I mean, this is just, I think, gotten more and more of a challenge for Linden Lab and Second Life, and for the idea of virtual worlds and immersion in general, because how do you immerse yourself in a 3x5 or whatever this is, 3x4 screen?
Wow, that.
Sorry about that.
No. That's it's interesting because I mean it sort of goes into something that I was going to talk about a bit later, but I might as well bring it up now. I mean there was a conversation I had, and for the life of me, I wish I could remember the person that I had this conversation with. But they were talking about this concept that 20-somethings today are not looking at virtualization the same way we're looking at virtualization. I mean, we're sitting here, we're in Second Life, our avatar is a bunch of pixels. And, everybody looks good and all this other type of stuff. But the way the 20-something crowd is looking at their quote-unquote avatar is more of an abstract concept. And where the technology sort of fits their view. It's almost as if they're creating their avatar is essentially a brand that they're wrapping around themselves. And the brand is independent of the technology. Mm-hmm. Right? So, I mean, whether you can run Second Life on an Android or on an iPhone or on an iPad, to a certain extent doesn't necessarily make a lot of difference, because that's not where the new generation that's sort of coming through high school and university, that's not necessarily where they're necessarily seeing themselves and how they're immersed inside a virtual environment. They're seeing themselves as in a much more abstract concept. And I guess, to a certain extent, I'd like to get some of your opinion about that particular aspect of maybe where that may be leading us from an economic standpoint and from an innovation standpoint. I mean, does the ability to run Second Life on an Android phone even have any meaning if 5 years from now the bulk of the way we're going to look at ourselves is more of a brand rather than an avatar?
Yeah, so I think that makes a lot of sense, and I'd put this. I mean, to go back to terms I learned very early on in my days in Second Life. We had the whole immersionist, augmentationist distinction, where I think what's happened is it's become much more difficult to be an immersionist. I mean, and that's when I talk about, what am I going to do with a 3-inch screen? It's going to be very hard to immerse myself in this, in a visual world with game-like physics and all of that. But the augmentationist side, where I just view Second Life as a way to do more stuff and with different people, I've always been an unabashed augmentationist. That for me, Second Life is just one more thing that I, Rob Bloomfield, do, as opposed to creating buyers sellers and thinking of actually having a sort of infusing my identity into an avatar and immersing myself in it. And it sounds to me like you're describing young people as being augmentationists. I think it's been the same technologies that make it harder to be an immersionist make it much more easy to be an augmentationist, because now, and I know my kids, they're, I have one kid who's, very big on Facebook, and he texts his friends, 20 times an hour or whatever. And, he's got his virtual community, but it's not a visual community. It's not distinct from his own identity. And really what he wants to do is just, get these little touches with people. He just wants to get these little, these opportunities to, to interact with someone who otherwise he couldn't interact with, which I think really is a huge part of if you're not a content creator in Second Life, it's all about the people. It's all about the community, building communities, drifting from one to another, finding, striking up conversations with unusual people that you never would think you would have met. It's a very, very different, I think the kids are augmentationists. I don't think they're looking to immerse themselves. The other thing, of course, is, but I think most of the people in this audience are my age-ish, and you know what? These young kids, they have the bodies we all build our avatars to be. So, they're immersed in something else.
Oh goodness, yeah, to have the body that I have in Second Life, that would be nice. To a certain extent, then, do you see, if you compare what's your view of what was promised back in 2006, because you've been in Second Life about as long as I have. We're getting into the 4 or 5 years inside this environment here. If you look at the promise, or what the anticipated promise of Second Life was, 5-6 years ago, compared to where we are right now, how do you see there being, the difference between where we were compared to where we are right now?
Okay, so I would say that Second Life has predictably was predictably underperformed what we all expected, which is, as an economist, I should point out, is a contradiction, because if we expected it, how could we predict that it would underperform? And I'll just, let me just trot out a couple terms from psychology. One of them is, the planning fallacy is one. Motivated reasoning is another one. So the planning fallacy, and we all experience this all the time, is someone says, how long is it going to take you to get something done? And if they're asking you, here I have something you need to do right now, sit down and do it, you can be reasonably accurate. But if it's how long is it going to take you to redo that website, or debug this code, or write that dissertation, or whatever, everyone is always way, way overconfident, and they overpromise and underdeliver. So that's the planning fallacy, and it's predictable because, we even believe ourselves when we say, oh, I can get that done in 2 weeks, I can get that done in a year, even though we shouldn't, because consistently people are wrong. So that's the planning fallacy. Motivated reasoning is the tendency that people have to grab onto every little bit of information that will help them believe what they want to believe. And so, just to pick an example that's been in the news a lot, Sarah Palin. There's been a lot of news about Sarah Palin floating around over the last few weeks, and what that tends to do is, the people who didn't like her grasp onto the stuff that they don't like about her, and they like her less. But the ones who did like her, they ignore the stuff that might be against her, that might, make them change their mind. They grasp onto the stuff that makes her look better, and and everyone's reinterpreting everything to make themselves, to be able to justify what they want to believe. And so when I think about what Second Life has done, I think really it's pretty, it's not surprising that Linden Lab made promises that were hard for them to keep about improving the technology. I think it's not surprising that all of us in the community were overly optimistic, not only about what Linden Lab could do, but also over-optimistic about all of the other types of all of the other technologies. I mean, we had on Metanomics, we had Mitch Caper, who, was talking about the various, 3D cameras that were going to do this and that and capture your expressions and allow you to fly. And, by gesturing with your body. It's not. I'm not saying these aren't going to pan out, but they certainly didn't pan out as quickly as we were all motivated to hope. So, another thing that I guess I'd like to emphasize, because I don't want to make this all. I feel like I'm sounding very pessimistic, but I think it's very important to think about Linden Lab as one company and to remember how change occurs. And the bulk of business innovation does not come from a company who says, "Oh, now we're going to come up with something totally new and different and reinvent the world." Usually what it is a new company with a technology that's so new that it's not really compatible with the existing technology. They come in, they are the game changer, and you have what Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, called creative destruction, which is if anyone who knows it from Marxist theory, totally different thing. This is really just the idea that it's the new companies coming in, the new ideas and new technologies coming in and really destroying the old, and so you get this leapfrogging. And so, if you look back at my interviews with I interviewed most of the top people at Linden Lab on Metanomics in fall of 2007 and spring of 2008, and I would always ask them about this leapfrogging issue. Is Second Life going to be there? Linden Lab going to be the company that's going to take this to the next level and really have it break out? Or is it going to be some company we don't know about that is going to overtake them? And so, and I've been looking at the companies that have come out, and none of them really, Linden Lab is still number one, which I guess is good for Linden Lab in the virtual world space. But I think it's a sign that the virtual world sub industry is not thriving and is not as promising as it seemed in 2007, 2008.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things that you've mentioned, and I'm furiously writing down notes here as we're going along, because there's just, every time I get a chance to talk to you, there's just so much interesting, things that come out of the conversation.
Can I see Mistress Amira Resident, if I'm pronouncing that right, asked a question. What about Morpeg companies? Mm-hmm. So I think that's a good question. And so the game companies, so this is Morpeg, the massively multiplayer online role-playing games, and I think it's great that they have such a long acronym that no one quite knows what to do with. But a point that I would make, I'd want to break that apart into really three pieces. So first you have the massively multiplayer online. And I think that aspect of the Morpeg technology has hugely taken off. And you just look at whether it's the light social games like Farmville or whatever, don't kill me just for naming it, or Facebook and Facebook and texting and all of this stuff. I'd say that that's the massively multiplayer part where you have all these people interacting, and so that's now I think that's where the internet is now. And I don't know how many people. I'm a very avid reader of blogs and news sites, and I love to read the comments. But it's gotten to the point where you go to the New York Times and Paul Krugman writes an article And it's got thousands of comments before you can bat an eye, which is, to me a bit, it almost makes me say I'm not even going to bother looking. So that's the massively multiplayer online part. And then there are two other parts to that. There's the role-playing part, and there's the game part. And I think those are, so a lot of people in Second Life enjoy the role-playing part, and I think that is the part that, when they make fun of Second Life on The Office, or when they make fun of World of Warcraft on South Park or The Simpsons, I think it's actually the role-playing part that they are making fun of, and that's the part that I think is always going to appeal to a more niche audience. The idea that you're going to be controlling a character, you're going to be a character that you're not. Yeah, okay. So Mistress Amira says South Park made fun of all of it, and of course, that's in their job description. So. But the game, that the last piece of that MMORPG is the game. And, people have always loved games. People are always going to like games. And I really, that's the part that's always going to take off. And again, that's the part, if I have one personal disappointment with Second Life, it's that it's not an easy place. I mean, their technology allows a lot of beautiful graphic creation, and it allows some ability to create games, but not to the extent that I'd like to see. I mean, when I think about what Second Life could do better while going the augmentationist rather than the immersionist route, it would actually be to rejigger the technology so that it would support residents being better able to come in here and create interesting games, create the back-end databases that are going to keep track of what you need to keep track of in games, and go from there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, from the technology standpoint, I mean, this is something that we've had discussions with other people about as we've gone along, and that it's interesting to watch people come into, especially new educators come into this environment, and the very first thing that they do is they bring all the old techniques with them that they used in the physical world, and it takes them anywhere between 3 and 6 months before they finally start to get it. That, oh, wait a second, I can do so much more, right? They sort of have to get over that and I'm going to use the word that everybody hates, but I'm going to use it anyways. They got to sort of get over that paradigm shift in terms of understanding the potential of the platform, and as you said, with regards to the gaming aspect of it, the ability to have non-role-playing characters in here, and the ability to do and just very simple things. Right, in terms of having an avatar be able to go over and pick up a glass off a table and have it appear inside their hand. I mean, that seems so simple if you look at other games from Xbox and PlayStation and Wii and what have you. But in here, it's next to impossible. I mean, we just simply can't do it. Right, the technology isn't allowing us to do it. So I understand where you're coming from with regards to that. I want to go back to something which you were talking about before, though. I mean, and sort of connecting this idea between what was promised and this idea of creative destruction. And in part, one of the things I'm wondering about was not one of, and maybe this is my own recollection being a bit fuzzy, but one of the original promised benefits of this that I had heard a lot of people talk about, and I cannot at this point remember whether or not Philip actually mentioned this or not, was not just in terms of technological change, but also in terms of social change. That the nature of what was happening with Inside Second Life was going to, at the risk of using a euphemism, which is probably not exactly correct, but I mean, it was essentially going to create this panacea where borders really were meaningless. Right, where we had a currency that would be worldwide, right? That we would have this opportunity to do things without, and to a certain extent, without government regulation, without oversight, without being able to create almost a utopian type quote unquote society, and be called the yuan. Yeah, it would be interesting to a certain extent, because what we've seen, especially over the last year, is really that's not at all what things have turned out to be. Right, Second Life has not become a ubiquitous platform across the internet, although it is free and open. It's really not that platform that I think a lot of people in the early days were sort of expecting it to be from a social change perspective. And I mean, I know you were talking a couple of weeks ago when you were talking with Doosan about this idea of, with regards to equilibrium assumptions in terms of aggregate outcomes and individual behaviors, being two of the major assumptions when you start talking about accounting and economic models, right? So, and it's also two of the things that you also mentioned at the time were two of the hardest things to try to model also with inside those particular environments. To a certain extent, how do you see the way in which social change has either benefited or maybe come back a fair bit from where we were, 5, 6, 7 years ago?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're talking specifically about Second Life, I think social change is just limited by the number of people you have and the ways that they can interact, and how let's just think about networks. It's how many nodes do you have and how many connections do they have and how quickly can they restructure their connections. And I think, Second Life is all the other things that I've talked about limit Second Life's ability to be a real engine for social change, just because there aren't, they limit the number of people, the number of nodes, and anyone who wants to complain about groups, the number of groups you can have and the difficulty of keeping track of everyone, and the difficulty of searching out businesses and finding live events and all that. I mean, all of those are things that reduce the number of connections that we can make. So, I think that now, if you look outside Second Life, if you look at social media, I actually, I am less confident that it's a good thing, but I'm pretty confident that there actually has been a lot of social change, and there's going to be a lot of social change that is driven by the advent of, very active blogs with lots of comments. Google has been incredible in allowing people to just, type in natural language into a search window and find a community where you can comment on their website. And then you add in Twitter and Plurk, and you're seeing, lots and lots of connections being made. And if we want to talk about social change, I mean, again, this is played up a lot in the media, but you can think about things like, the almost revolution in Iran. I know people have been talking about Tunisia and the role of the internet there, and, people trying to find proxy servers and all of that. So, I think, can the web create some types of social change? Yes. How is Linden Lab and Second Life doing it? Not so well, because they don't have the nodes and they don't have the ways for people to make connections. And is it all for the better? I'm not so sure. There's a lot of research that's going on now looking at people's web viewing habits, and it turns out that for the most part, just looking at politics in the U.S., Democrats, people who are liberal go to liberal sites, and people who are conservative go to conservative sites. They're finding one another. It's arguably polarizing more. good or bad. What do I say? I report, you decide.
Yeah, I guess in part I was because it's interesting. I mean, a lot of the examples that you were citing really, they're outside of Second Life. And although we have web on a prim here, I mean, it's still a lot of those connections, the ones that seem to be more important. And not to take away the personal connections that people develop with inside this virtual context, but we still haven't quite hit, it seems, the quote-unquote killer app that sort of bridges virtualization or virtual worlds with these other social phenomena that are occurring outside of 3D virtualization, 3D virtual worlds.
Yeah, hold on, let me find, there's this great article by F-Train, I don't know, it's called The Web is a Customer Service Medium by Paul Ford. Let me paste this.
Yeah, actually, Bevan just sent me a copy of that earlier. I was looking at that
here,
just
I'm
before we
pasting
got on
this
here.
into local chat. And I'd just be interested in, those of you in the audience, if you've seen this already, just type a +1. And because I think it's really, this guy has a very useful way of thinking about media. And he says, he has this subsection called the fundamental question of the web. And he says, let me just read a tiny bit of this. He says you can define a medium in terms of how it looks, what it transmits, wavelengths, typographic choices, bandwidth. I like to think about media in terms of questions answered. Here's one question. I'm bored and I want to get out of the house and have an experience, possibly involving elves or bombs. Where do I go? And the answer is you could go to a movie. How do I distract myself without leaving the house? You might turn on the TV. I'm driving or making dinner, but I want to make it more interesting. What should I do? Well, radio, especially talk radio. And so the question that he asks is, what is the question to which the answer is the internet? And so he comes up with this little question, which is, why wasn't I consulted? Which is WWIC. So I expect we're all going to see this a lot. Why wasn't I consulted? It really gets to the heart of, I believe, why a lot of us find social media and the user-generated content aspect of Second Life so appealing, is that it gives, it gives me a chance to be a talk show host and ask questions the way I think they should be answered and direct the conversation that I want to hear. We can all, in Second Life, we don't just have to complain about how some hosting company is doing something, if that's how you want to think of Linden Lab. We can actually get in and say, you know what, I think Sims should look like this, and we make them. And I see people are, Kiki Walpenheim is saying personal podcast, and, you see lots of people doing that, or they're creating YouTube, and it's all about wanting to believe that we are, I guess psychologists talk about efficacy, self-efficacy, that you want to believe that you can actually change the world in some way. You have control over your environment, and especially if you're a guy, you have control over other people's environments. So again, the question, we can think about this as a larger issue for the web. But now, if we turn this to Second Life, and I guess I should have thought about the answer to this question before, or really, thought about the question. To what question is Second Life or a similar virtual world the answer? And is the question, I want to dress up as or be surrounded by beautiful women? Is it I want to be able to create a world, that is my world using my imagination? I'm not sure. I think, as I say, I should have thought about that before we started talking.
Yeah, I guess. Well, to a certain extent, I mean, you could always go somewhere along the lines of, my imagination and no limits. I mean, that's certainly, one area where this environment tends to excel. Mm-hmm. It's interesting though, because I mean, one of the things that we've seen over the last year, and sort of related to this, is I think a disconnect between policies that Linden Lab has been putting in place over the last year, and it almost seems as if they have been systematically deconstructing almost every piece of what I would consider to be their competitive advantage. And specifically over the last year and a half. And it is really related to this question in terms of why wasn't I consulted? I mean, one of the strongest things that has bound the community here was the fact that they were consulted, right? And that Linden Lab had a very strong connection to the community. And it seems that systematically over the last year or so that they have dismantled that. And to a certain extent, some of the challenges that we're seeing them going through right at the moment are very much a direct result of this, right? That because we've become disconnected from the input process, we've now got what John Lester, a Pathfinder Linden, had been talking about recently in terms of this idea of a walled garden. OpenSim has now all of a sudden become a major alternative to Second Life. And while the value proposition probably isn't exactly there just yet, it does represent, to a certain extent, a fracturing of the community. Because if we can't be consulted within Second Life, then why not go someplace where we can be consulted? And so you look at Reaction Grid, you look at InWorlds, you look at Spot on 3D, you look at Project Wonderland, you look at, if Blue Mars ever gets their stuff back together again. You look at these other virtual worlds, and they're still got this consultative process in place. And it's the one thing that seems to be, probably Blue Mars unlikely, but it seems to be one of those things that we've been trying to get this idea across to Linden Lab, that they've been deconstructing the most crucial part of the competitive advantage, which is really the people. And I mean, you look at Facebook, you look at eBay, you look at Craigslist, you look at any number of these social phenomenon, and the social network is really part of the production process. And that's part of what brings these people together. And so I guess to a certain extent, I'm wondering, from an economic architecture standpoint, I mean, have we in fact dismantled too much of what really has made Second Life special in terms of where we're at? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a good question. And, so, of course, Linden Lab, okay, let's take the example of Craigslist. I mean, I think, right, Craigslist exists entirely to allow people to find one another, to, trade whatever goods and services they have in mind. The technology is very straightforward, and it's really a network effect, a positive feedback loop more than anything else that makes something like Craigslist work. The idea, and this is a really common one in markets of any kind, that everyone wants to go where everyone else is going. And so Craigslist is out there, and so if you have a small-scale product or service that you're trying to buy or sell, that if you go to Craigslist, other people are thinking the same thing, and so you'll find your transactional partner there. So I think, when I look at what Second Life has to get right, I mean, I think the first thing is, I mean, they have to have something. People are not coming into Second Life to transact with one another, and so the question is really, what are they trying to do? The first question, and here I agree with you, is, are they trying to interact with the world, or are they trying to interact with other people? And I think it's, really it's both. I mean, I'd say it's mostly the people, but they want to interact with the people in the world. That's presumably why they are here rather than somewhere else. And so, but then the question, you're asking, well, what are their policy decisions? I wonder how much of what they're doing is really policy mistake as opposed to just trying to deal with the technological problems that they're up against. I mean, I remember having a talk with, I think this was Ja Uri, a couple years ago. He actually came to Ithaca, and we had a chance to talk in person. And he was telling me about, the difficulties of just the mathematics of the group chat, and how costly would it be to add one more group to everyone, and at what point do they have to completely change their architecture? So it's not so much, I think a lot of these things are not so much policy issues as they are, technological challenges, even where everyone agrees on what the goal is, which is to, be able to do more interesting things in the world with more people. The other thing that, where they have laid down policy is really more on what I'd call the regulatory front, where or the policing and enforcement front, where they're saying you can't gamble if you're going to engage in explicit activities. You're going to do it in specific locations, and you can't run a bank. Those are really the three biggies that I've seen since I came into Second Life, and I, there's no question that big communities built up around all three of those, and they've all been harmed. The communities have been thwarted in their desire to do what they wanted to do by Linden Lab, and the right, you can ask questions about whether those were wise for the larger community, and there, I understand Linden Lab's reasoning on all three of those, but boy, that's I don't think that's the
Well, I mean, to be fair, I mean, on the banking side of things, I mean, anybody that went through the 2006, 2007, quote unquote banking crisis, where banks were popping up, they take people's money, and then all of a sudden they disappear, and there was no accountability. Right? I mean,
right. And so the, I mean, I think that so that's the argument in favor, and of the banking ban. The argument in favor of the gambling ban is that that it was illegal, and that Linden Lab suffered the risk of legal action in the U.S. and and the sex, the idea was that, well, there are all these people who aren't coming into Second Life because they're worried, there's sort of this taint on the entire world. And, and I think those are all reasonable, but they all went directly very, very. So a couple things. I mean, one is they went very, very contrary to the libertarian ethos that that Linden Lab had promised. So when you ask, you asked before about sort of, to what extent did Linden Lab and Second Life fulfill its early promise? I think one of those early promises was an extremely libertarian view, and you can be in favor of libertarianism or not. I'm not a huge fan in the real world, but I think that it would have, if Second Life really wanted to have a niche, and I saw someone, I missed who this was earlier, someone said Second Life, I'm just scrolling through the chat, Second Life will never survive until they reincorporate in Sealand, which I believe, if my memory serves, is like an old oil rig in the middle of the North Sea that is free of jurisdiction, and so you can, they could allow people to do whatever they want, and I think there's actually something to that. I mean, if you really want to think your world, your imagination, that means that if you run a bank, and I see there's some bankers defending themselves here, and investors who still have their money. I think that's reasonable to say, your world, your imagination, your risk. Anyone who put their money into one of these Second Life banks and couldn't predict that they weren't going to get their several 100% interest rate back, that was pretty silly. I was studying all those things because because basically and actually anyone who's interested, if you Google Bloomfield and unregulated stock markets in Second Life, I think you'll find my SSRN page where you can download a recent paper that is coming out in the Southern Economic Journal on SL CapEx, one of the stock markets in Second Life. You look at this and you say, this violates everything. These markets violate the most fundamental beliefs about rational economic theory and financial markets. And it's really a very simple issue. These markets provide no investor protection, and therefore, what standard economic theory says is they should have no investors. No one should be willing to give their money to an anonymous person on I don't even want to call it a contract or a security. Basically, you give the issuer money, they claim, they state that they are going to keep you informed about their business and pay you something back.
Yeah, but isn't this to a certain extent, though, where you were talking with Deucen a couple of weeks ago when you were talking about individual behavior and that people are not necessarily rational? I mean, the fundamental assumption in economics is that people make decisions, quote unquote, on the margin. The margin being, whatever feels right at that particular point in time, right? And so, somebody comes up to you and says, hey, give us a whole pile of money and we'll give you 60% interest, right? Yeah. With inside a gaming environment, it sounds like a good deal.
Well, and one of the questions we can't answer in this paper is why exactly are investors giving money to issuers in the absence of any sort of legal or regulatory investor protection? And one answer to that is, well, it's a game, for God's sake. Couldn't you figure that out? And maybe that's what's going on, but I think it's actually I think it's different. I think that individuals, and let me now I just had a debate with someone over this, so I'm gonna make you all live through this, my view on this as well. But you have to, so economic theory assumes that you can look at markets, especially financial markets, but lots of other markets, as if everyone is rational. And that as if is really important. And I think what's happened with economists is that they have forgotten that we're only, theorizing as if everyone's rational, and instead they start thinking, well, everyone is individually rational. And that's just, anyone who has a kid or a boss or a spouse knows that individuals are not rational. None of us are. But what does happen in market settings is that competition and other economic forces will drive prices to reasonable levels and will protect people in lots of very clever ways. And people build institutions to protect themselves, or people will, get an insurer. They'll get insurance and rely on the insurer who has a lot of money at stake to try to deal with this. And so anyway, the point, you're getting back to the bigger point. I think that Second Life, one of their promises was to be a libertarian playground. And they did it for a while, and I thought what they did was fascinating. It was interesting to watch the gambling and the games that people created, and it was fascinating for me personally and professionally to watch what was going on with the with the markets. To me, and I'm sad that we lost that. Although you're right, we probably protected a lot of people. We probably kept a lot of people from losing their money. So going back to the original question about Linden Labs policies, I mean, maybe they need to be a lot more gutsy and forward and say, look, Linden dollars are not real money. If people are exchanging this, we're going to try to figure out how to set things up in here so that we can have legal gambling and we can have, legal stock markets, and we are going to let people do what they want. And we're going to see a lot more creative destruction.
We have only a couple of minutes before we sort of have to go off the air in terms of the recorded portion, but obviously I'd like to continue the conversation even beyond once the broadcast portion is done. Just in a couple of minutes, I'm wondering if you can maybe give us some idea in terms of what you see sort of the next 2,500 days sort of looking like. And I realize that's a very big question. Well, virtual worlds in general, because I think when we start talking about this, we're not just talking about Second Life, but we're also talking about what Second Life has ended up spawning in terms of, it's very easy to criticize when somebody has been creative, right? Because it's sort of like, I can do that, but it's the creative effort itself that is really the hard thing to do. And it's always easy to criticize after the fact. So we've gone through, 7 years, 2,500 days of Second Life. And now we get to look forward to the next 2,500 days. But we know it's not just Second Life. We also know it's Open Sim. It's going to be whatever the successor to Blue Mars is. It's going to be Unity 3D. It's going to be Project Wonderland. It's going to be all these, Cobalt and all these other different things that are out there that are now playing in the same space that Second Life is. So where do you sort of see the next, 5 to 7 years sort of going?
Yeah, and of course, all I can do is be wrong. My goal is, right, if I say 15 things, one of them will pan out. And when I look back at this, I'll say, see, I was right. That's the motivated reasoning I was talking about before. But no, let's say, you mentioned the other technologies, and I think that's really where, if we're going to try to see where this is all going, we need to be thinking about the other technologies, because technologies ossify. And they, think about right now if Second Life said, we're going to make a major change, and instead of prims, we're going to have prums, and they work a different way. And you can leave your prim stuff up for a little while, but, as of December 31, 2011, everything's going to be replaced. And, right, it isn't just the technology that's going to keep Linden Lab and Second Life from making the major changes it needs to really go to the next level. So I think leapfrogging is the future of user generated content oriented virtual worlds. I hate to think what that acronym is like. So let's look at the other technologies, and OpenSim. So OpenSim suffers from the technological restrictions. I mean, I know it's not Second Life exactly, but it's right. It's similar enough that they're going to, that they've ossified, and it's going to be hard to make major changes. I think Unity seems much more flexible and much more promising, much more adaptable to different media, and I know that some very good people are working with it now. So, I think what I'd say is if I were to look at virtual worlds and the immersive aspect and user-generated... Well, actually, I have no idea. Can you... Actually, maybe someone in the audience knows this better. Maybe you can't actually do user-generated content very easily in Unity. And so someone's going to have to take the idea of user-generated content and build it in a completely different framework. And that's really, I think, where we are going to see the big advance. There are other things that seemed, I just don't know. Probably one of the most exciting technological advances that, in my mind, that really seems to be coming mainstream is, motion detector style. Right? We had the Wii, the motion detector controllers. So the Wii, you hold it, you move it around. Now we've got what's it called, Kinect, and there are some others coming out, where there's actually a camera on you and you do stuff. That's interesting. I don't think it's going to be quite the ticket for Second Life for a while. But just because the technological hurdles, it still doesn't seem like they're quite there. And two, and more important, is that I just don't think it isn't clear to me that really answers whatever question it is that is bringing people into Second Life.
Excellent. Well, we're going to wrap up the on-air portion of Inside the Avatar Studio at this point. And buyers, I invite you to stick around because I would actually like to continue the conversation for a little bit after we go off air. For right at the moment, I would like to very quickly thank yourself for being here with us for the past hour. This has been wonderful to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I'd like to say thank you very much to Bevan Whitfield, who's helped pull this together, in addition to Mel Burns and Robitus Hash, who have been helping us with the stream to NBC and Metaverse. So, thank you guys. MetaWorld. Thank you guys very much for your help and support. And I know we're on a bit of a time deadline for what you've got there, so we'll let you do the count out at this point, and once we're done there, then we'll come back and pick up the conversation with buyers.